Cyber Monday. Joining me as always is my co-host, Mr. Dominic Vogel. Dominic, who do we have in this hot seat today?
In the spectacular hot seat today is Tamara Little. She is the principal at Coast Communications. And I think it's going to be really cool what she's talking about, the whole notion of being able to have a strong crisis communications plan. So many organizations just don't worry about how they're going to talk in a crisis situation until it's actually happened. So that's really cool that she'll be talking about that. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff she'll be talking about as well when she's talking about sort of that level of transparency and timeliness and the tone as well when you are communicating during a crisis, whether that be internally to your staff or externally to the world. So there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff that she touches on.
Mm-hmm. You know, this is really geared towards business owners, small and medium-sized businesses, and so I think that's the whole message today when talking to Tamara. Is it's about it's challenging for those types of organizations that haven't had crisis in other areas to suddenly have to deal with a crisis in the area of cybersecurity. So she's going to give some real practical advice on that. So I'm going to hop over into this chair. We're going to invite Tamara in, and we will be right back.
Tamara, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us in studio. We're really looking forward to this conversation. I think we're going to have a lot of fun.
Great. Thanks for having me.
So let's start off. What kind of companies do you work with?
Well, at Coast Communications and Public Affairs, we're a really full-service team. And so as a result, we work with a broad range of types of clients. I think what a way to characterize it is clients that have complex reputational challenges or opportunities on either side. So it could be resource sector, could be healthcare, education. If we have our druthers, we love capital infrastructure, resources, transportation, but we're really there to support the clients across all sectors, depending on what their needs are.
Mm-hmm. So obviously, public relations, why is it important to have a good post-data breach, in our case, because we're talking about cybersecurity, post-cyber attack, post-data breach, public relations plan?
Well, evidence in terms of studying corporate reputation has determined that organizations can go through a crisis, and the classic example in Canada is Maple Leaf, where people actually passed away as a result of an unfortunate incident related to listeria. But if you effectively communicate after the incident and follow all the best practices, you can come out not only with your reputation intact, but perhaps for some companies, more importantly, your bottom line intact. So there's a fiscal element to corporate reputation management, and the moment when you're most at risk of losing that reputation is a crisis. So doing it well afterwards helps you keep that glass full of corporate reputation.
And it's really interesting, this whole notion of crisis management, which leads into sort of data breach management, especially from that PR side. A lot of organizations still will focus more so on the preventative side, like the security, the control, the IT, the techie stuff. How do we sort of shift that discussion and say, if you don't have a plan in place, a PR plan, here's where you should start. So maybe the first question is, if a company has no PR plan for after a data breach, where's a good place to start?
Well, it's really about analyzing your risks, not so dissimilar to your business. So what we would do is go in and understand what are the corporate reputational risks you have around this issue. Do you hold a lot of private or sensitive data? Is it data that is under some kind of regulatory environment like GDPR or the Canadian rules? And then really build out a plan based on that. We're all about making sure it's the right scope and scale. You don't need an IBM-size cybersecurity crisis comms plan if you're a smaller retail chain that's got 50 stores across country. So we want to make sure it's the right approach, and it's really based on what those risks are, and then basically pulling all the best practices that we have in our profession that we've been using for the last 30 years to put that together.
That's really interesting. And if we were to sort of split that sort of communications piece, is an important piece in which there's the external facing communication, but how important is the internal facing communication as well in terms of staff and sort of what's happening as the crisis is unfolding?
Yeah, I mean, when I think of PR, I think of TV cameras.
Outward facing.
Public, outward.
Yeah, and certainly that part of it is very important, that media relations component, that issues management component. But when we approach communications and PR, public relations, corporate communications, same thing, we look at it from all audiences. So sometimes the audiences are external. They could be the public, the market, consumers. Sometimes they're governments or your regulator, and they can be internal. So the way I think about it is that first and foremost, you have to always make sure your internal teams are aware of what's happening. And sometimes we have a question asked by people saying, well, do we give them a different message than the people outside? And we say, no, it's always a consistent message, but you want to get to them fast because first of all, they're with you right there in the trenches. They're a great asset for you. And second of all, they're going to be distracted from what's happening. And in a crisis, what defines a crisis versus an issue is actually the failure to be able to operate as a normal business. So the faster you can get your team up and running post-crisis, which means communicating well with them, the better you can start recovering from the crisis and get back to operations.
That's really interesting. And maybe just hopping back on the external piece then, to sort of maybe two follow-up questions. Who would be the best person in an organization to be speaking to the public or their customers, let's say post data breach? Should that be a CEO or should that just be a PR person? Are there some best practices around that, or I guess it varies as well?
There are definitely. It's a really good question. There's definitely best practices, and the answer is all and none. It really depends on each scenario. The way we evaluate it is what is the topic that you're speaking about, and can the spokesperson be authoritative and compassionate, empathetic, and articulate about it? Sometimes it's a matter of tone too, and so we've seen examples around North America. BP is an example where sometimes the CEO of the organization was a little bit flippant and a little bit less empathetic. So sometimes the person has the right information. For example, they might be your CIO, but they don't have the right tone. Same with the CEO. Sometimes the CEO has the right tone, but not the right information. So we're always evaluating that. Question about using communications people like me, we're happy to do it, and many times in my career I have. What we generally say is that you want to have the person who knows the most about the issue. Now, I often know a lot about a lot of things, but I'm not the expert. So what we do is work collaboratively with our clients' experts and have them able to be successful. So we media train them in advance, and we support them through that.
That's interesting. And then sort of, I guess, the last piece to that is, and I think we've seen various case studies, especially in the data breach field, where companies that handle it well, it's pretty clear what they're doing well. But I mean, there have been other case studies, namely Equifax, going back. I know this one's been beaten to death, but that was an example of a breach in which their response to it, or at least their public response to it, made it that much worse. The CEO was not very transparent. It was confusing in what they were saying. They were backtracking. They were playing the blame game. What are some tactics that either maybe from a PR perspective that they should stay away from?
Yeah.
Another thing that Christian and I have always talked about is transparency.
Oh, yes.
Especially after a data breach, when facts sometimes are hard to come by.
Yeah.
Where do you draw that line between transparency, facts, speculation? Again, it's a loaded question. I'm sure you could talk about that forever.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's something that keeps a lot of people up at night. I've done a lot of work on not just cybersecurity and privacy breach crises, but also a lot of natural disasters, things where really there's a lot at stake, and information flow is very, very difficult. You never have as much information as you want ever. But what we say is tell it all and tell it fast and tell it fairly. And, you don't have to give all the information if you don't have it all, but you certainly have to give some information and continue to have that engagement. One thing I've seen go really wrong on a lot of the cybersecurity issues over the last 2-3 years is that organizations wait too long to tell their customers or their key audiences or their regulator, and then they're pulled to telling everyone instead of actually doing it on their own. And
so they lose trust a little bit.
They do, yeah. And so, for example, Desjardins, in the last week or so, they've done a really good job of being very open, articulate. They've got a great website, great protections now in place, proactive ones for their customers, but it took them about a month to do that. And the consequence, trust, corporate reputation, and this is always a tough one for organizations, they're pulled before a government committee, and no one wants that. So, really making sure that you come out quickly and don't lie, be empathetic.
Don't speculate.
Don't speculate by any means, and accept some responsibility. Sometimes that means that people like me are in some interesting dialogues with the lawyers, and certainly, we have different perspectives, but our job is to protect that corporate reputation and trust with the audiences, and sometimes saying, listen, we made a mistake and we're doing everything we can to prevent it next time and to fix it now goes a long way.
So, obviously the leader has a role. You talked about the internal people having that consistent message. How did you say that a business leader should conduct themselves in such a situation, both from,
like you just talked about, the public side of things, and also how should they lead internally through this as they're going through the
As they're going through it.
disaster?
Well, crisis of any sort in an organization can be very emotionally draining. It's upsetting, right? You really care about your business and your customers and your team. One thing that definitely helps is bringing people in from the outside, more because not only are we experts in it, but we also have that different perspective. We're a little bit less emotionally attached, and we can be a little bit more looking at it at a 20,000-foot level.
You're almost like that psychologist or therapist kind of safe person.
Exactly. We had a client that had a privacy breach, and it affected a lot of their customers. Happily, no major damage done to any of them. And after about 4 or 5 days, we went in and said, okay, how are your people doing? Are they eating? Do they need lunch? Has anyone broken down yet? And they said, actually, yeah, we're getting to that point. We said, that happens because in a crisis, your adrenaline's flowing, your executive is really focused. But then over time, other work gets in the way. People get a little tired, making sure you get your teams rotated. But it really starts actually way before the crisis with your executive and your leadership, which is in the prevention and the training side.
Yeah, this might be a wrong question for me to ask, but that was going to be one of my questions: is what's the kind of mental state and the emotional state and kind of the anguish that people go through? Like, what are some of the things that you have seen? Maybe you've observed it in your clients, or maybe you've just kind of seen it happening.
Absolutely.
Over in the distance.
Well, when we do crisis communications training for clients, I actually begin with a cartoon which has the phases of grief as an analogy of phases of a corporate communications response to a crisis.
Right.
And you do go through those phases of denial and, bargaining and all those things. It's very similar. But I think professionals, in-house or external, they're very good at managing crises, and they understand the best practices. We train in our industry. There's great Pro-D on it, lots of great case studies. And so, hopefully people try to look at it as professionals and bring that kind of professional perspective. However, we are emotional beings, and so people, it affects them. And so making sure you change the team out, make sure that your leadership is really there supporting the team that's leading the crisis work, and that you bring in the right resources. If your regulator needs more information and your team is at its end point, then bring in some external help for that period of time. It's not the time to be worrying about pennies.
No, exactly. And I think we touched upon this, the importance of the plan, having that PR plan or having someone help from a partnership perspective, help go through that. A lot of companies that we've run into will still say, if a breach or crisis happens, we'll just bring in someone at that point. How can we sort of change the narrative around that, in which it's important to be prepared before it, not just bring it in as Rome is burning to the ground?
Don't try to negotiate when the house is on fire.
It's a little too late to start learning how to put the flames out. Well, my dad was an electrical contractor, and he always had a saying that he had two prices he charged for people. The ones that came to him, first, prevention and assistance from professionals, and the ones that made a very costly and possibly dangerous mistake electricity-wise, and they come later and it's more expensive. When we're called in a crisis, we of course are professionals. We can activate and turn on a dime. That's what we do. But what we like to see is organizations think through these things and prepare in advance. So that's why we work together on a workshop where we actually offer privacy breach, cybersecurity breach, and crisis communications prevention together, because for a lot of my clients, they're very used to how to manage a crisis of, say, a political issue or a pipeline burst or something of that more operational nature. But the teams, IT, communications, HR, operations, they've never really talked about privacy breaches or cybersecurity impacts before. So a workshop, even planning in advance, gets everyone speaking the same language, and they're preventing problems because they actually start identifying some of them in advance. And that makes them more cognizant.
That's, and I think, like you were saying, it's about shifting that mindset and getting that level of awareness and that level of buy-in throughout the organization. And when we're talking about data breach response plans, I know we've also run into this as well. So much of this is based on our experiences.
Another controversial question.
There's some who say, we are in such and such a sector, or we're too small, we don't have to worry about that. Is this something which companies of all sizes should be planning for at some level? And I know you mentioned earlier on that what that looks like will be different depending on the company size, but is that something that every company should be at least developing something?
Absolutely. And I'd say that right now in Canada, part of it is because it's required of you by law. And so our colleague, Ali Brown at Kirkay Consulting, who's a privacy expert, she would say, if you have certain types of data, about certain people from certain jurisdictions, you are by law regulated to manage that in an appropriate way and report if you're breached. So first of all, you just have to do that. I would say really any organization that's got customer content where if it's on the front page of the Vancouver Sun, it's a problem for you, then you should be planning for that in advance. That's the general way we'd approach it. Now, of course, different organizations have different audiences with different needs. Customers are actually quite forgiving when there's a cybersecurity breach or privacy breach if you communicate appropriately and quickly and you offer those remediation, around monitoring and protection in the future. So any organization can look at those. It's not really nearly as expensive as you'd think, and certainly doing a crisis communications plan can be scaled to any kind of size of an organization. Or maybe you work with others in your industry and you learn about it at an industry level so that you can go back and operationalize it within your own team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are many examples. It's pretty widespread that there are a lot of companies that don't have an awareness of cybersecurity risks or privacy breach risks. I imagine that they haven't even given a thought to the PR side of things.
No.
Let's go on to the positive side and think about, the lessons that we've learned as you've dealt with your clients and the things that you've seen, done wrong. Of the companies that are doing it right, and they're good examples. Can you talk about some of those organizations and what components they have in their plan that really just work?
For sure.
Practically.
I would say in general what we're seeing is organizations that are already accustomed to major crises are doing well at managing cybersecurity and privacy crises as well, because it's just another hazard or risk that they have to manage. And they're really adept at that. So the TransLinks, the Hydros, the large oil and gas companies or utilities, the large electricity transmission companies, organizations that are dealing with crises of some nature all the time.
Just a daily course.
It's just what they do, and they're really good at it. Some of those utilities do crisis communications and operations crisis workshops and tests 6, 7, 10, 12 times a year.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Organizations that maybe have had less public-facing corporate reputational challenges because they're a little bit more business to business, they probably haven't been as able to prepare for these. When it happens, it's a little harder for them because they're not used to dealing with, a lot of media spotlight on a controversial or challenging crisis.
Mm-hmm. So without singling out anybody, can you think of an example or two of industries that are really need maturity in this area?
Yeah.
Is it manufacturing? Is it law firms?
Well, you know what? I think we're seeing a lot in the financial services sector.
Right.
Obviously that's a dominating one. We've had a lot of credit unions, we've had a lot of banks, a lot of subsidiary services, insurers, that whole industry. And a lot of that industry is regulated not just by the federal and provincial governments, but it's regulated by IROC and other regulators. And they're getting quite sophisticated in their expectations.
Yes.
So definitely I'd say right now we would love to see the financial services industry as a whole work more with our communications industry and their own internal people to get a little more prepared for that, because they just house so much data about people. So much.
So much to lose, so much to protect.
Lose. Absolutely.
And reputation is, paramount there.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Equifax, how many of us really even knew who they were before the breach?
Exactly. Yeah. That was probably one of the, I think I remember reading that their Wikipedia search just went through the roof after the data breach there. And maybe even just staying on that same vein, with Equifax, people have said, they bungled the PR part of that. For companies that may bungle that PR piece, at least out of the gate, what options are there to
course correct
to
that.
sort of exactly fix that and say, you know what, we made a mistake, here's how we're going to improve, or is there a point where it becomes too late?
I don't think it's ever too late. I think you can always improve your way of communicating effectively with your audiences, whomever they are. And it's really about understanding those audiences' needs and being responsive and empathetic to what they are. We all know that if we had an impact to our own financial information, we would want to know.
Yes.
And we want to know fast, and we want to know what we could do to protect it. I think that's just a completely normal thing. So I think that the more we see organizations realize that a little faster, the better they're going to do. However, if it just takes them a little time, and then they kind of move to a place where they're feeling like they're ready to talk more about it, and usually it's because they've skinned their knees a little bit, it's better late than never. And so again, Desjardins, right now, if you go and look at what they're doing this last week, it's really quite good. Just took them a little long to get there.
Right.
Equifax, they were sort of one of the first. So it was a lot of those organizations not sure how much the public would care. Is it's going to be a big issue? I think we all now know it's a big issue.
Well, I mean, in reality, it's actually an opportunity for them to win people over.
Absolutely.
Because at the end of the day, as much as they need to have good protections and plans in place, they're corporate victims. And so
Absolutely.
there's that side of things where they can bond with their clients and stakeholders and customers right there. It's such a golden opportunity to do
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah, and using an example outside of the cybersecurity world, Maple Leaf, right? I mean, a
Yes.
really devastating example of an organization that had real impacts, did everything a communications person would want, as well as from the operational side. And as a result, people feel really strongly about that brand. And in fact, people like me and pretty much everyone else in our sector still uses that great video of Michael McCain apologizing as our example of what you do. Is it easy to do? Absolutely not. Very, very hard and a little terrifying
I
sometimes.
think so.
But what we often say to our clients is that if someone sues you, you can contain it. You can actually continue your organization's work and sell your product or whatever it is. But if your reputation results in no trust, it's really difficult to recover from that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's funny that the old adage, we've heard this and it's becoming a little more consistent from a drumbeat perspective. I think we hinted at it earlier, in which so much time there's that emphasis on immediately how they respond to the breach, maybe from a technical perspective. But I think we're very much in an age now in which how you respond to it publicly arguably can make a minor breach a major breach, or from an impact perspective, if you don't handle that PR piece properly. And I guess my question to you then is, I know we see a lot from public-facing companies, private sector companies as well, which may feel that they're behind the wall. Maybe they're under certain regulations, or they don't have a public sort of body to be accountable to. Is this still something that they should have on their agenda?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think that every single small one-off store has to have a crisis communications plan or a cybersecurity crisis plan by any means. But that's where you can also look to your industry associations for assistance and for help. We often present at that level where we, have large conferences. We'll go in and say, hey, let's teach you the basics. And what we say to clients is like, with this 3 or 4 hour session, it'll get you through the first 4 or 5 hours at least of a breach.
Yeah.
But what I really love what you talked about, Dom, is that integration of the team.
Yes.
Because that's where we really want to go. We don't want the IT team and cybersecurity experts and the comms team to meet the first day when there's already a hack that's happened and it's on the verge of breaking in the media. It's already on Reddit.
Right.
We want to make sure we actually have those conversations and have a dialogue. For example, when I started doing crisis communications in cybersecurity and privacy a couple years ago, we found people didn't know the difference between privacy and cybersecurity issues. They were conflating them together. So, and it's an education process, I think, for everyone. And if we as communicators can do our part by bringing everyone together in the room and getting them ready for that, an ounce of prevention, as they say.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Tamara, I think we're out of time. I think we could probably talk to you for an hour.
Well, and you
So
too.
much more to say.
Thank you so much for taking time to
Thanks.
chat with us. I know we'll be chatting with you again soon, so we
Great.
really appreciate it.
Great. Well, hopefully we only work together when we're doing the prevention side and not just when it's a crisis.
Yeah, we have our fire suits ready.
That's
so,
right.
Yeah.
Thanks so
That's
much for
our
your
aim.
time.
Thank you.
Tamara.
Okay.
And Christian and I will be right back.
Well, I hate to say it again, I sound like a broken record, but another fantastic episode, I think. What was your number one takeaway?
And I agree with you. I think we have this epic run here of guests, and it's been fantastic. The main takeaway I really like from Tamara's conversation was the fact that with organizations that take the time to plan out their crisis communications, when crises happen, it's just going to be a little blip in the radar. But if you don't take that proactive approach and have a communication strategy in place, that crisis can quickly escalate and can be a massive sinkhole for your organization. So that old mantra of be prepared, I think that really rang true today with what Tamara was talking about.
Yeah, I think, there's such high stakes for organizations, and, done right, it's an opportunity for a company to bond with their clients and customers and gain trust. But done poorly, done with the wrong tone, and you can really lose that trust. I want to say thanks for watching. If you want to watch more of our podcast, you can go to conversationsthatmatter.tv, and we will see you next Monday.